Good evening, my dear friends. I am very excited to begin with you the third book of the Rambam, the book of Zmanim, the book of time. In this book, the Rambam will be discussing all the laws that are connected to a specific time. So, Maimonides begins this book by quoting a verse from Tehillim, from Psalms of King David. And he says, I inherited your testimonies forever, for they are the joy of my heart. And in this book, we're going to be learning a whole bunch of laws. The laws of Shabbat, the laws of making an Eruv, making a private domain, the laws of Yom Kippur, the laws of the holidays, the laws of Chametz and Matzah, the laws of the Shofar, the Sukkah, the laws of the Shekel, the half shekel that they were given in the time of the temple, the laws of the new month, the laws of fast days, and the laws of Purim, of the Megillah, and of Hanukkah. So, over here, we are going to be beginning with the laws of Shabbat. And I want to just tell you, my dear viewers, all of you who are investing time every day to study some Torah, to learn some practical laws, where the Rambam gives us an understanding into Jewish law. We're going to be learning over the next month, God willing. There are 30 chapters in the Laws of Shabbat. We're going to be learning over the next month the Laws of Shabbat. The Laws of Shabbat are, on the one hand, very practical, very important, and we have to know them very well. And we're going to be going through them. We're going to be discussing various ideas, all these different details in regards to the Laws of Shabbat. But I will tell you, these laws are quite complicated. And some of the things we will not discuss in their full length because it's a little bit beyond the scope of this setting. But we will try to get it as clear and concise as possible. And, of course, you can go on to Chabad.org. You can find the text of the Rambam. There's lots of commentary, lots of footnotes that we will be skipping in our discussion over here in this class. But if you want to reach out to me, if you want to study the laws of Shabbat more in depth, you can definitely do that. But without any further ado, let us begin the laws of Shabbat. And the Rambam tells us that there are 5 mitzvot, there are 5 commandments in regards to the laws of Shabbat. 2 of them are positive commandments, and 3 of them are negative commandments. So, it goes like this. Number 1, we have to rest on the 7th day. Number 2, we're not allowed to work on the 7th day. We're not allowed to perform any work. Number 3, the Beth Din, the High Court, is not allowed to administer punishment on Shabbat. Number 4, not allowed to go out of the limits that were established by the Torah on Shabbat, as we will discuss later on. And number 5 is to sanctify the day by taking note of it, of taking note of Shabbat, which is actually one of the reasons we make Kiddush. So, these mitzvahs are all going to be discussed over the next 30 chapters. God willing, it's going to be a trek as we go and delve into these laws. L'chaim. So, resting from labor, from work on the 7th day of Shabbat is fulfilling a positive commandment, as it says in the Torah. You shall rest on the 7th day, and anyone who does not rest, but instead works on the day of Shabbat, has first of all negated the observance of this positive commandment of resting on Shabbat, and also has transgressed on a negative commandment where it says in the Torah, do not perform any labor on it. So what happens to a person who does work on Shabbat? So if it was something which the person did willingly, so then this person has what is called karet, which is an excommunication, which the High Court would administer. And if there were witnesses and he was warned and so on and so forth, so then that person would actually be put to death by the High Court. And if it was done by mistake, so then the person would bring a sin offering, which is spelled out in the Torah, exactly how that is done. Now, in general, whenever we talk in the laws of Shabbat, that if a person does a certain thing, so then, and they are not allowed to do it, and they are liable, so usually we say, that means, as the above mentioned, of what they would get if they do it purposely. If it says they are not liable, or, if it's something which, if it was by mistake, so then they would bring a sacrifice. But whenever it says that they are not liable, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's allowed. It just means that it's something which they are not liable for, but it could still be something which is not allowed. Because there are many instances where there is a rabbinic prohibition which was put into place in order to keep us from getting to the actual sin, to the actual performance of something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So the rabbis put an extra boundary in place, like a barrier, so we shouldn't come all the way to the actual performance of labor. And therefore, there are things that we're not allowed to do, but if we do them, we are still not liable, but we're still not allowed to do them on Shabbat. So we're going to get into this later on, more into depth, but this is just a general opening, just to understand the terminologies, so to speak. And then there are things that we're allowed to do them. We're allowed, it's permissible, we're allowed to do them, and they're totally fine to be done on Shabbat. So, in regards to things that we are allowed to do on Shabbat, so the Rambam begins by telling us that things that we're allowed to do, even if eventually, because of this thing that we have done, something else might come out of it that is not allowed to be done on Shabbat, we're still allowed to do it. For instance, if a person is dragging a bench outside on a gravel ground, and it's not a very heavy bench, but it's a bench that has a certain weight, and if you drag it on the gravel, it's going to move the gravel somewhat, and it might even make a groove in the gravel as you go. But since it's not a very heavy bench or table, so it's not necessarily going to make a groove. Now, making a groove on Shabbat, we're not allowed to plow our fields. We're not allowed to make grooves in the ground. So, if it's not definite that there's going to be a groove made by you walking, so then you're allowed, by you pulling this bench in your garden, you're allowed to do that. And because you don't intend that in making this groove, you're just trying to move this table or this chair or this bed from one place to another. But on the other hand, if you're going to be pulling a heavy bench, which you know for a fact that it will make a deep groove when you pull it because it's a very weighted and heavy bench, so then you're not allowed to do that. And actually, the case which the Rambam uses is a little bit of it's brought down in Jewish law. It's brought down in the Talmud. This case that evidently back in the day they didn't have a lot of toys. But if you had a person who wanted to give a chicken's head to serve as a toy for a child, and therefore will cut the head of the chicken so that the child will have a toy, but therefore the chicken will die while he's at it. So then, in such a case, even though he says, well, I'm not trying to kill the chicken, I'm just trying to have a toy for my kid. But that will not work, and that will not be allowed to be done on Shabbat because it's definitely going to kill the chicken. I mean, there's no way of removing a chicken's head without killing it. So, therefore, that is something which is not allowed to be done. But so that's the case which the Rambam mentions in regards, and it's actually, this case became a terminology in Jewish law in regards to the idea when you do something and something which is not allowed will definitely take place because of that action. So that's something which we're not allowed to do. Except for the fact that probably we shouldn't be killing chickens to play with their heads, but that's besides the point. Someone who performs something which is not allowed to be done on Shabbat, even if he's doing it not for the actual thing that he's doing, still they're going to be liable. In other words, if there is a candle that is burning, and now a person wants the wax or the oil for something else, maybe the jug and where the oil or the candle is sitting, so therefore the person will extinguish the lamp and want to take the oil or the candle for something else. That is something which we're not allowed to do, even though we don't care about the actual fire, because we only want the oil or the wick or something else. But still, because we're not allowed to extinguish fire on Shabbat, even though you don't intend for the fire, you're intending it for the oil or for the jug, that's something which you're still not allowed to do. Or similarly, a person who is, there is a nail that's sitting in the road, and a person is saying, it's not good to have nails in the middle of the road, so the person will carry it and move it somewhere else. So that's something, again, which we're not allowed to do, because we're not allowed to carry something outside even though we don't care for this nail. We're just trying to move it so that to make the road, to make it safer, but still, it's something which we're not allowed to do, even though we don't intend for that actual thing. But if a person does something with one intent, and then another intent happens, something else happens, something which he didn't think about, something which he didn't want should happen, so then the person would not be liable. For instance, if a person wanted to throw a rock at an animal, which is a very terrible thing, but as he threw the rock, it actually didn't hit the animal. Instead, it hit a tree, and it knocked down the tree, which is something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. But he didn't actually have intent to knock down the tree, he wanted to hit the animal, but it never actually got to the animal. So in such a case, the person would not be liable. You're not allowed to do it, but you're not liable, because on Shabbat, a person has to have in mind to do this certain action that they're doing. If they don't have in mind the action that they're doing, they don't have the intent for the action, so then they're not liable for it. So for instance, if a person wanted to, is climbing up to the tree on Shabbat and wants to pick some fruits off the tree, and the person wants to pick dates, and instead they picked off a grape instead. By mistake, they thought it was a vine, and it ended up being a date tree, or the other way around. So in such a case, they would not be liable, because they intended one thing and something else happened. They got the wrong fruit. Now, but if you have two candles and you wanted to extinguish one of them, and by mistake you extinguish the other one, so then still that person would be liable, because you had an intent to extinguish a candle. Now, although another candle was extinguished, but the actual action that you wanted to do happened, although it was with the wrong item. So it's like as if you wanted to take one date and you picked off another date. I mean, it's the same food. It's the same action which you wanted. It's what your intent was. It happened with another one of the same type of fruit. So that's a very interesting thing. And then the Rambam just says in general that if a person is doing something casually, just without a specific intention, just without thinking, a person is sitting there and is looking at the candle and just without thinking extinguishes it, so then that person would not be liable, because they didn't have an intent to do it. And so too also, if a person wants to perform something which is not allowed, but it actually ended up happening more than what he intended, so then the person would be liable, because what he wanted to do happened, and then happened extra. But if he wanted to do something, and instead of happening all the way, it became less, so then they would not be liable. So he says, for instance, if a person wants to carry something, so we're not allowed to carry on Shabbat in a public domain, but they were planning on carrying it while it was hanging off their shoulder, behind them. So in such a case, since it's less protected because it's behind you can't actually see it. And then eventually, instead of carrying it behind you, you actually carried it in front of you, which over there you're actually able to see it and it's more effective. So then you would be liable because you're doing the same action that you wanted, but you're doing it more than what you wanted. But if a person wanted to carry something and watch it as they were walking and, be focused on it to watch over it, and then it happened that they were carrying it behind them for whatever reason, so then they would not be liable because they intended it to be in a safer way, in one way, and then it ended up being in a lesser way. The Rambam continues to say that if a person wanted to perform a specific labor on Shabbat, and they began doing it, so let's say a person starts writing a letter, writing a note to someone, which is something which we're not allowed to do. As we're going to see soon, the Rambam goes into all the different specific actions that we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. But if a person wants to write something on Shabbat, and they started writing this letter, and they write a line, 2 lines, but they didn't end up finishing writing the whole letter. So the Rambam says they would still be liable, even though they haven't completed the entire thing that they wanted to do. Or if they wanted to weave something, a dress or a blanket or whatever, and they didn't finish completing this weaving project, they would still be liable. Because once a person has written 2 letters, which creates a word, so then they would already be liable. Or if once they weave 2 strings together, that's already something which we're not allowed to do. What happens in a case where you have something that can be done by one person, but 2 people do it together? So let's say, you have an item which you want to carry outside, but 2 people together carry it, or to write something, and 2 people together write it. So since every person on their own was able to do it, but now they're doing it together, so now it's as if they are only doing half the action. So now they would not be liable. It's something which we're not allowed to do, but they would not be liable. But if it's something that one person is not able to do on their own, there needs to be 2 people in order to perform this action. Maybe to carry out a very heavy table or a very heavy pillar, and each one needs the other one in order to be able to do it. So then they would, in such a case, they would be liable. And if it's a case where one of them was strong and one of them was a weaker person, and the one who was stronger was able to do it on his own, and the other person wasn't able to do it on his own, so the person who was able to do it on his own would be liable because they were able to do it on their own. But the person who was not able to do it on his own would not be liable because he's just helping him out. Whenever a person does something on Shabbat and he is destroying, it's in a destructive manner, so then they would not be liable. It's not allowed, but they would not be liable for it. For instance, if a person destroys clothing, just rips clothing, or burns them, or broke a dish, just for the sake of breaking the dish, so then in such a case they would not be liable. Although it's something which we're not allowed to do. I mean, in general, it's something which we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be destroying items. But in regards to the laws of Shabbat, since they are destroying something, so then they would not be liable. But if they're destroying it in order to fix it, so then they would be. For instance, if a person demolishes a house in order to build a new house in its place, so then they would be liable. If a person erases words in order to write new ones in that place, so then they would be liable. And the Rambam finishes off this chapter, and this is the end of today's discussion, that whenever a person performs something which is forbidden on Shabbat, If they are doing it intentionally, they have to be doing it intentionally the whole time in order to be liable. If they do it with an intent, and then at a certain point there are certain parts of their action which are done unintentionally, so then they would not be liable. Or the other way around, if they do it something unintentionally, and then there's a certain part that they do intentionally, so then again they would not be liable. Because the action has to be done in a complete form, either entirely intentionally or entirely unintentionally. So that's an interesting concept. But that is the end of today's chapter, the first chapter of the Laws of Shabbat. So I hope it's not too complicated. If you have to watch this class again, I would invite you to do it, because there are many foundations that the Rambam is putting down over here in regards to the laws of how the laws of Shabbat work, and it will clarify things as we keep on going. We're going to put this picture together as we keep on going along to get all these details into place, and hopefully at the end of all of this we will have a better understanding of how to keep Shabbat in a more proper way. So my friends, I wish you all a very good one, and we'll see you tomorrow.